Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the virtual book launch for Mary Odden's Mostly Water. Before we get started, there are a few thank yous. Thank you to the Homer Bookstore for hosting this. Especially thank you to Jenny, Sue, Lee, and Michael. We appreciate very much the many ways that you nourish the community in Homer and the rest of Alaska. We appreciate all that you do for writers. And thank you to Red Hen Press, particularly Toby Harper, whose technical expertise is making this happen. And now the disclaimer. This is a panel that's being brought to you by people all over Alaska and even one person in Arizona. We haven't used this format before, and so just be aware that if there are technical glitches, we will get through them. Toby has asked me to tell you a little bit about Boreal Books, which is the series that I edit under the umbrella of Red Hen Press. In about 2003 or 4, Kate Gale, who's one of the founders of Red Hen Press, talked to me and to Eloise Klein-Healy. She did not want the editorial taste of the press, the editorial decisions on the list, to become calcified. So she asked me if I would do a book a year, select a book a year by a writer from Alaska. And she asked Eloise if she would select a book a year by a lesbian writer. Now think of the courage that takes for a publisher to say, I'm going to give up 2 titles a year to someone else's taste. That's really quite amazing. So that was 2003 and 4. And finally, our first book, Leaving Resurrection by Eva Salidas, a Homer person. So that seems fitting. That came out in 2005. We now are working on our 20th book in the Boreal series. I'll just show you a couple of others. Frank Sosis, because he's going to be on camera today. Frank Sos did the writing. Margot Klass did the artwork. Let's see. Yeah, I've got it. Frank Sos and Margot Klass, A Double Moon. And then the book that we are celebrating today. We thought in the midst of a global pandemic and a nation that is having right now in very tumultuous times to examine its conscience and all of its injustices, and at the beginning of fire season, that would be a great time to launch a book. So Mary Odden, lucky Mary, gets to launch her book now. Our MC today is going to be Jeremy Pataki. And Jeremy was one of the founding board members of 49 Writers, a group that has done more than anybody else to nourish the writing community in Alaska. And Jeremy has done that for a long time. He and Susanna Mishler, another Boreal author, used to do a series called Synergies. And it's the only time that I've read in the company of a banjo player and artwork at the Anchorage Museum. So it's a terrific thing for him to bring together so many different kinds of art. He is the author of a book of poetry called Overwinter. He has worked as a poetry teacher. He has worked as a community organizer, and he splits his time between Anchorage and McCarthy, where he is now. I think that's everything I have to say. Jeremy, to you.
Thanks, Peggy. I'm really honored to join this fantastic group of writers connecting from all throughout Alaska and from Arizona to support Mary Odden and her awesome new book. I'll kind of quickly introduce each participant. I think beginning with Karina Cook, since she's here beside me. And then we'll have a conversation with Mary and also get to hear a few passages aloud. Karina Cook's first essay collection, Leave Takings, is coming up this fall from University of Alaska Press, part of the Alaska Literary Series, which Peggy's fundamentally involved with. Thank you. So watch for opportunities to pre-order that this summer. Karina is a former Fulbright Fellow, currently writing new essays that focus on Alaska and Yukon art, ecology, and history. Also, today we have Lisa Alexia. Lisa is a writer, a publisher, a mother, and a physician assistant. She spent years living in a remote village and founded Denali Sunrise Publications. Through that, she promotes books of relevance to rural Alaska. definitely check out her website. She posts really great reviews of a well-curated selection of books. She's recently written about Mary's book, and there's a lot there, so do check that out. We're also very glad to have Frank Sos here. He has mentored some of the finest writers in Alaska. He's connecting with us from Fairbanks. He's published 2 volumes of short stories, including Unified Field Theory, which was awarded the Flannery O'Connor Award for Short Fiction, and a collection of essays called Bamboo Fly Rod Suite. With the painter Kess Woodward, he co-edited the anthology Under Northern Lights, Writers and Artists View the Alaskan Landscape. And he also, as Peggy mentioned, collaborated with another visual artist, his wife, Margot Klass, on Double Moon, Constructions and Conversation, which pairs his own mini essays with her work. And his latest book, called Unpleasantries, is a book of essays published by the University of Washington Press. Like Peggy, he is a former Alaska State Writer Laureate. Finally, we are so happy to have Peggy Shoemaker with us. She's a very gifted poet and writer, and a deeply generous and involved literary citizen, both in Alaska and beyond. She's been honored by the Rasmussen Foundation and the National Endowment for the Arts, and has also served as an Alaska State Writer Laureate. Peggy is the author of 8 books of poetry, including Cairn, her new and selected volume, and her lyrical memoir is called Just Breathe Normally. She's Professor Emerita from University of Alaska Fairbanks, and teaches in the Rainier Writing Workshop MFA program at PLU. She serves on the advisory board for Story Knife, a fantastic retreat for women writers near Homer, and she's on the board of the Alaska Arts and Culture Foundation. As you heard, she's editor of Boreal Books, the series which is an imprint of Red Hen Press, and publisher of Mary Odden's new book that we're here today to launch. Peggy is also editor of the Alaska Literary Series at University of Alaska Press. She's poetry editor of Persimmon and contributing editor for Alaska Quarterly Review. She's had an immense role in literature here in Alaska. Thank you all for tuning in out there. Thanks to all the fellow panelists for taking the time to celebrate the launch of Mary Odden's new book, Mostly Water, whose book has just been released. So finally, it's a huge pleasure to introduce Mary, whose essays have appeared in the Georgia Review, Northwest Review, Nimrod, Alaska Quarterly Review, and that Under Northern Lights anthology. Mary was born in Eastern Oregon, traveled north to work on forest fires in Alaska. She studied writing at the University of Montana and the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and has worked as an aviation dispatcher, a village teen counselor, a writing teacher, and as publisher and editor of a small newspaper in Alaska's Copper River Valley, where she lives with her husband in Nelchina. She received a Rasmussen Foundation Individual Artist Award to work on the essays gathered in her gorgeous book, Mostly Water, Reflections, Rural and North. Very excited for you, Mary. Congrats on the new book. Could you just begin by telling us a bit about how it feels to introduce this book to the world and share a bit about the process of writing it?
Okay. I love seeing all your faces here, and I would love just as much to hear you continue to talk and not listen to me talk. But I want to express gratitude, first of all, to Peggy for a gentle nudge, which I think was about 10 years of gentle nudging, right? and all the people of like minds and questions. You know, we don't all have the same answers, but a lot of people who had a lot of the same questions as I have helped me so much. So this book, maybe 25 years, some of the thinking beforehand. I was working on it already when I was in the MFA program at UAF in 1995. So that's older than some people are. There's Red Hen asked me, Boreal Books and Red Hen have been so gracious, and this book would have been much different if I hadn't had the kind of help that they provided to me. But Red Hen asked, do you want to launch this book or do you want to wait? And it has been so long that I said, don't wait, let's do it. But I'd like to say there's some advantages in this. The importance of written words and the intimacy and the direct experience that we all feel that written words can provide has been really important to me in this time, other people's words. And so I'm happy to put mine out there in this time. And there's a sense of living in history that's pretty intense with the pandemic going on. So shout out to the folks who are suffering, who are not as lucky as we are, as I am. So I think that it's essays. This is a memoir. But it's linked essays. They came out of ideas. And one very kind review at Forward Reviews said, "Oh, it's not memoir or essays. It's nature writing." So I don't know where Homer Bookstore is going to put it on their shelves, but I'm grateful that they will do that. You had something to start with, Jeremy, and Karina, I think, about from the river, or Seeing the River. It's an essay that I wrote about McGrath and also about the Alaskan landscape. Would you like me to start with that?
I would be delighted if you wanted to start with Seeing a River. I know that you're interested in talking about some ideas that you have about epic, for example. So maybe you can talk us through the big insights that take shape in that essay, and then perhaps give us your thoughts about the epic.
Okay, I bored several people with this idea, but it's important to me. Poetry to me is probably most important of all kinds of writing, because it takes you down into the depths. The sound of the words, how far they are apart, how they look on the page, the other things they mean if they were by themselves. You know, poetry uses everything to take you down deeply into language, and I've hoped that prose writers can do that, and it's what I would like to do. So the idea of lyric and epic. Who was the writer who skewered Dan Brown so entertainingly at the writers' conference for pulling people from event to event along by their nose? And a lot of people like to read like that, a story that takes them from event to event. But I thought of the metaphor of river, and where a river can take you and how much it hides. And this is an essay that Frank and Cass Woodward published in their other Under Northern Lights, called Seeing the River. And it says the guy that wrote Ecclesiastes was in such a bad mood because it's all birth and death, birth, death over and over until it all ends and we're dust to dust and we're gone. Said, well, maybe what would cheer him up and the rest of us is that things that happen, the stories, take us down into the river at the place they happen, into the river as in time. So hopefully that's in here and explains it better than I can when I explain it. So this is from Seeing the River. It's on page 136. Stories are hidden in the river as... Uh-oh. Whoa, we got an echo here. Shall I just keep going, Toby? Stories are hidden in the river as they are in history, yet the parts are greater than the whole. They do not deaden, discourage, despair. They come into view and pass out of view, usually unfinished, and their details offer a vertical dimension to the flow. If I don't look for names, search out the memory of particular people who have lived where I live, the forward movement of time erases definition and specifics. all the evidence of the deep vertical axis of my life. To avoid despair in the strong current of generations, I must uncover names, moments, old jokes I don't understand. We have always been new things under the sun, each of us. McGrath has been built at least 3 times. The first time, just after 1900, it was called McGrath after Peter McGrath, a U.S. Marshal, and it was up at the Forks, so called because that's where the Nixon Fork runs into the Takotna River. That place was the farthest that boats from downriver could reliably travel toward the mining districts on the upper Takotna and the trailhead to Ophir on the Anoka River side. There was a warehouse at the Forks owned by Archie Higgins from Takotna Village, and he had a gas boat that shoved a little barge up the Takotna River, but he had to wait until it rained so he could get his boat up over the shallow riffles. After a few years, though, the boats that came upriver got bigger and the town had to move down to deeper water where the Takotna runs into the Kuskokwim. That's where it was in 1917 when David Alvinza-Ray, the wireless operator for the Army Corps of Engineers, fell off the tall wireless pole where he'd been repairing something and was killed. My friend Margaret, who has lived in one McGrath or another since 1929, told me about this wireless operator several times. When she arrived in McGrath, the story was polished but still fresh, told by many and connected in many directions across Alaska. Now she is its only storyteller. And in the version I heard her tell recently, the wireless operator had no name, only the wireless operator who got killed. So the life of that story is nearly over, an empty frame. But I know the wireless operator's name because she used to know it and tell it, and because the water was high enough this spring for us to get our riverboat over into Old Town Slough. The cabins have mostly been eaten up by mushrooms and rot and roses, but there's an outhouse made from half of a round-holed boat, green paint still clinging to it in patches. And David Alvinza-Ray's grave with a small granite headstone. The grave still has a neat picket fence, though the white paint is all gone. This is about the only thing left of the second McGrath. What would have been obvious about McGrath in the 20s and 30s would not have been Dave Ray with the house made from half a boat, but the big Northern Commercial Company warehouse and shipyard on the upstream side where the Takotna ran into the Gulf. Margaret says there was a dog barn for travelers and mail carriers, big enough that you could drive your sled right through the middle of it. If you were the mail carrier, Carl Sasui, coming in from Talida, you'd leave your sled in the barn all night and bed your 20 or so dogs down in the stalls on either side of the sled run. Every mail stop had a dog barn. You drove right up off the river and into it, Margaret said. Old man Dan Sprague was a buffalo hunter from Montana who was a feature of the second McGrath. He had a homestead across the river where the town is now, and he had come over to what was then McGrath in the daytime with an unlit lantern so he could light his way home in the dark after an evening of poker. But the game would stretch into night and back into the short winter day before he'd whiskey weave across the snow and back across the river to his home, lantern still unlit. In the summer, his farm was literally a one-horse operation. He'd borrow Vanderpool's old white horse so he could plow his field. Vanderpool, the magistrate, lived one bend up the Kuskokwim, a mile and a half away, so they'd bring that horse up and down in a boat. Sometimes it wandered down through the woods on its own to be around people. When Margaret tells me about Dan Sprague, she often points to where his cabin used to be. A square of absent land off the end of the crosswind runway, long washed away by the shifting Kuskokwim. She said he was a nice old man with long white whiskers when she knew him in 1929. The NC Company had to move their warehouse and store across to Sprague's homestead in 1935 after the Takotna ate through its bank and into the Kuskokwim, one bend above its old mouth, which silted in the very same summer and became too shallow for the steamboats. The rest of the town followed gradually, buying up lots from the NC Company. Now what you see when you look across the Kuskokwim from the boat slip is a cut bank, all the same height, But where the Takatna used to come out, the willows are a touch shorter, maybe 30 feet instead of 35. And that's how you know the river has hidden the channel and has hidden the town where the channel used to go. Rivers shift, and then towns drag their heels to new banks and wait to be washed away again. Margaret lived on both sides of the river because she came up to McGrath on the steamboat Tana in 1929. She saw the second town go down and the third one rise up. People and events flow through her talk so you could watch them coming and going. We drink tea, couch and chair angled toward each other, and are surrounded by the hardware and mementos of a wilderness life, a river life. Nameplates from the steamships, log tongs, lanterns. I am amazed by Margaret's varied enterprises, trapping, freighting, cooking for mining crews, and by her stories of her father, the steamship captain. She knows a trick that turns canned milk into a caramel-tasting flavoring, but you have to use a stove with plates, not burners. I like the big garden she still grows in the deep river dirt of Dan Sprague's old homestead, and the delphiniums as big as blue trees above us when we sit outside in the summer. Margaret can't remember if she or Dorothy Stone brought the first delphinium seeds to McGrath, but now they're in every yard, and sometimes a stalk or two leans up out of the wild grasses and the bedstraw along the road, invisible until it blooms. So,
Thank you.
So these, these rivers, the Kuskokwim in this essay, people paid attention to the river, and the towns paid attention to the river. And when the Second World War came along and the airfields came with it, an interesting thing happened. The towns moved around. The buildings scooted, starting to pay their attention to the airfield instead. And this is something I noticed in a connection that I have with Karina. I'll call you out, because in her wonderful essay, A Traverse, she talks about how the highways looping through the country on one of her journeys north reminded her that when you're traveling, your reality narrows to those roads and their shapes, maybe piled up like ropes in the cities, but then changing people's views as they move out through the countryside. I think that's something that we have in common, is the interest in the shape of rivers and the shape of highways and how they shape our ideas of history.
Part of what you've done in this essay is to give us a very nuanced portrait of interior Alaskan rivers as social spaces. They're particularly spaces alongside which human meaning is made and then remade and then altered and then reconfigured. And I think that's a really exciting aspect to this essay, particularly given how much a river is like a road, right? How few roads we have and how many waterways we have, and how these waterways are fundamentally social spaces. And then on the other hand, you're very interested in environmental harm. And so I think that this also starts to get at an important tension in your book between the social importance of the environment, and at the same time, some of the really painful ramifications of our place in it. Perhaps others have something that they want to bring up around that, or maybe Mary, maybe you would like to respond at this time.
Yeah, I think that awareness comes and goes in the book because they were created over such a long time. I don't. Maybe we should go to go to a different essay, unless somebody else wants to jump in with something. I could talk about March, because that essay over time changed. The narrator changed. Shall we go there?
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So, Karina and others also
So
asked me about.
page 45.
Okay. I can
Page
go
45
there.
in March, I think, is a pretty interesting place to uptake this conversation, because you have some human reliance on the land, as well as a consciousness that human absence, might be in the land's future.
Okay. Okay, so having probably started this essay when I first came to Nelchina in really early 80s and gone out with this wonderful trapper person who had come up from Minnesota. He was a soldier in World War II, had been in Italy after the war, been a Minnesota dairy farmer, wanted all his life to come to Alaska. It was his deep desire to do so. We ended up being neighbors, and he ended up being a grandparent to our child. He and his wife were like parents to us. So I think I was the first narrator is just excited to go with Norman and my husband Jim, who share this farming background and this deep interest in trapping and animals and a deep knowledge of animals. And then gradually after I returned to this essay, I realized that I was worried a bit more. I was thinking, who are we when we go so far, when we throw ourselves so far off of the human trails, and what are we trying to meet out there? Now, I believe I'm going to start on 42. How are we doing for time? Am I just going on and on here? If we're okay. Okay. 50 miles north and decades ago in March, traveling with Norman Wilkins, hundreds of caribou are coming through the 11-mile trail. We sat on the snow machines and watched the animals cross into the black spruce, a continuous stream of mostly cows and calves for long minutes. Norman calls it a caribou carousel. Says the animals are just making a big circle down on Whole Lake, coming around again. A bunch of youngsters trots and jumps across the trail a few feet in front of us, heads thrown back, noses in the air. Jim says, looks like school's been let out. We're not hunting. We're just along with Norman as he sets his traps for the last time this winter. My husband and Norman are thrilled to be standing on this last white edge of the season, and I am along to watch them. I am a young wife, but with Jim in the woods, I've always reverted to a role I like even better than a wife. I'm a kid playing house in the wild country, following a dad or older brother and making jokes and small trouble, even as I learn to drive, walk softly through brush, hold a gun, shoot it. When I was a dozen years old, I was the 410 to their 12 gauges, the 22 to their 30-06s. Jim and I hunted grouse along a road in Montana before we were ever married, and I shot one I shouldn't have from the roadway just as a pickup truck came along to see me do it. I kept my head down. I stood in the barrow pit alongside the road, the dead grouse in my hand. The driver pulled up next to Jim, rolled down the window, and laughing said, "That's okay, I like to see a kid get a bird." Jim of the gigantic red beard and blue eyes held his mirth until the truck was out of sight, then came over and lifted me off the ground like I was that kid. I have terrible stories, too. Another new hunter and I shot white-tailed deer from too far away and then had to find them and kill them. The ruined face of a fawn struggled up at me as I cut its throat because, horrified already at what I had done, I had left my gun down the hillside when I came running. And once I shot a moose I couldn't find. A friend on that trip said, "It's good for the ravens, they got no knives." But those tragedies have risen through all the clean kills of my life until I'm not much interested in pulling the trigger anymore. My mother, distracted by a small brother she had in tow, once walked across a cornfield with the safety off and a shell in the chamber. That moment scared her so badly she would never again pick up a gun or go hunting. Like her, I can imagine being the agent of awful harm. But I love the shape shock of seeing a big animal. When Jim or a hunting companion kills an animal, I like knowing that it has died with a smaller suffering than what ends most lives out here. After its death, I'll thank the animal for its meat, slit the skin up the belly to roll out the guts, help to take off the shoulders and the legs, then the ribs, get my gloves and pant legs bloody kneeling in the moss. This is the blood that brings forth life, the kind of blood I know. We play by the rules as we understand them and bring everything home that we have been taught how to use. Nothing is ours, so we are grateful. I believe in give and take. I believe in liver and onions. So there's some odd things that happen grammar-wise in here. Because if you are different narrators and you want to honor them and leave them in, you kind of have to tell the reader who they are and separate them. So that's one thing that happens. And there's some things that happen with past tense and present tense that is always a challenge for me, because you're not just following a subject chronologically, but you're jumping in because the subject raises the ideas, so you're going back and forth in time. So the end of a paragraph just after that one, an example. I accept that Jim and Norman will do most of the navigating, deciding, chopping, even most of the cooking while we are out here. All I have to do is reach out for a big cup of coffee or cocoa when Norman hands it to me. There won't always be these big, broken knuckled hands. I know this even then.
So, Mary, I wanted to hear you talk a little bit about time in both ways, that you do move through the past and the deep past and the present, and you smush all that together. But the other thing that is interesting to me is how long it takes to make such an essay, because you say you started that a long time ago. So how do you make them, and how do you go into time and find what you want?
So forever is the answer to the first part of the question. It takes forever. I think the first thing that happened was that I wanted to send something to Norman and to thank him. And I wrote him a letter. And then, of course, I kept that letter because it was important to me. And then I returned to it and thought this needs to also be an essay that shows the me through time looking at this country. And so I don't have a big, I don't start with form or structure. I don't think it's an idea that I follow. I do some research. When something else occurs to me out of my memory that has something to do with the essay, I'll just drop it in. And then I'll go back and I'll think, you know that if you have to trust yourself that what you want to write about is important. And it's a great thing to tell students because they don't trust themselves. If you thought of it, it probably belongs in here. And all you have to do is dig far enough to make the connections visible. So I'm inside and outside of this essay for probably years. I don't work on it all the time, but that's the essay that's the oldest. in the book. Did that get there? Yeah. A lot of the connections. I also want to say, there's you're writing or you're editing. Those are two really different things. So a lot of the connections that are made, or me saying this is important because, is me going in afterwards and finding out why it needed to be there. And so when you see that language, that's probably the editor, Mary, popping in to say, I wanted to give you this because it's related.
Okay, I think that's good. I think it asks questions about what you want from your readers too. And I'm thinking about shooting the elk in the middle of the shape of an egg, and how, because I've used that essay times, and that part of it really sets some of the readers back. What? Why is she telling me this now? And it's kind of it troubles them.
Well, I think shooting the elk was, it's the only, it's an elk hunt that I went on by myself, and Jim and his friend went, tromping there miles and miles up the mountain. I went down into a sort of almost a hidden place of the mountain and fell asleep, and it had this sense of magic to it. I woke up, there was an elk there. I shot the elk and I went down, and I just felt that in my body, the risk of doing it, the giving of its life, the blood everywhere, what I had to do, because I was so silly that I only had a Swiss Army knife. And I know that it's exactly like your Swiss Army knife because I've seen your Swiss Army knife. And that's all I had. And so I spent hours there, and I'm not sure all the connection, but I think it was so in the body and so basic and important to me that it had something very much like giving birth to my child.
I'd just like Mary to talk a bit about patience, because you have been very patient with your language, and often writers who are impatient or careless with their language are able to dash off a whole lot of stuff that is not very thought-provoking, and a whole lot of stuff that is not very wise. And what I really appreciate about a lot of your language is that it's so carefully crafted. It doesn't have a false polish. It's so carefully crafted that we know it comes from the entire being. It's fully embodied, as you just mentioned. It's deeply emotional. It deals heavily with the spiritual life. It talks about how we are finite, but also gives us tremendous joy in the moments that we have. And I just like to say thanks for those things. There's no question in there. I'm just saying thank you.
Thank you. I want, admiring poetry and the care that goes into poetry. I always would want to give that care to writing and to my writing. And believe me, I'd like another 15 or 20 times through this book to make it tighter and take out the that's that I don't mean, and change the Transportation Safety Administration to the Transportation Security Administration. As many times as editing is so important, and it takes other people to do it and other eyes. And the wonderful editor, Joeth Zecco, that you provided to me at the very beginning, helped me see a lot of these things. But confidence again, to students or people who are writing, the confidence to spend the time with the language is where the patience comes from. Trust that what you want to say has a truest manifestation of itself, and try to go there. Yeah. I see a Lisa question forming.
Yeah, I was thinking, I think what hit me the most about the book as a whole was a semblance of when that river part you talked about the layers, and you talked about the depth, and the way you did that essay was you went through the layers of the stories, and thinking about how you came in as a settler. And this is a story of so many white people who come to Alaska. We come into as a settler, and I identify certainly with the story of coming onto the land, and how we do that, and how do we do that with respect and care. And missing from a lot of nature writing is how we do that culturally, because there are people here who came before us who are deeply a part of this land, and have been very, very patient and tolerant. And so the interactions that you talk about throughout your book, I really appreciated and enjoyed those. And I think that there's not a lot of that in nature writing, in nature writing or memoir of moving to Alaska. And so there's a real mix of things here. Yeah. So that was one thing. And I know you and I have had conversations, and you probably had these with other people, about regionalism in literature, and how on earth can you have a deep work of art without a sense of place? It's beyond me at this point in my life to understand how you can do that. Everything about your story and your work is so rooted in being in this place.
Well, it wants to be. There's my virus and threat protection. Thank you, Windows. It wants to be rooted. It wants to be careful and generous. And I know several of us heard Luis Alvera Uria talk at AWP. Let me find that quote. What he said. I think I tried to write down everything he said. He's the wonderful author of The House of Broken Angels and many other. We may not come from a place, but we come from the story we tell ourselves about that place. For me, that takes a lot of pressure off my ethnicity, my gender, my age, my demographic. He said, "I am more interested in bridges than borders," which is it's such a gracious thing, because of course his literature is about borders, but it's more deeply about the bridges between people. So I would want to be useful in that way. The essay that I think is most about what you're talking about is From the Air. It's an essay about when we came to Alaska and worked for the Bureau of Land Management as firefighters, which to claim myself even as a white settler is deeper than those roots allowed. I think I wanted to be, I wanted the people in Kobuk, in Huslia, in Hughes to be my aunts and uncles, as later the people in McGrath would be. But we spent a lot of time in the air. And I thought, I am looking down at unimaginable layers of stories below me. And I had that thought, and we were such. I'll just read you the first. I won't read so much because I see the time flowing away, but I'll read the first two paragraphs of that essay, which I should be able to find because I have a little tab in it. So there were voices I listened to at the university, because that was my work for a long time, was to transcribe. I transcribed a lot of indigenous elder people and pioneer people. It takes 8 hours to transcribe an hour of spoken voices. Well, now machines can do that for us. And after you do the interview, then this little thing pops up on your screen and it says, where would you like me to send the transcript?
Mm.
Well, we're in a different age, but listening to an hour of voices for 8 hours was something that I try to convey in this, and as part of my learning. There was those people in that time. That's the thing that I learned from a narrator that I listened to. We worked as firefighters in the Kobuk River Valley for 6 summers, from the receding of ice and snowbanks in the spring, as on this day in May, to the September snow lines marching down the Cosmos Hills around us until the ground was white. There's a visual pun I could share with you. The huge British-made Argosy cargo planes we used were painted white and dark gray with the white on top. I have a photograph of November 1430 Zulu sitting on the Doll Creek runway, exactly echoing the paint job on the September mountains around it. Unlike the mountains, but very much like me, it would fly away. I say we worked, but I was a puppy and I didn't know the difference between work and play. Loading a helicopter or making a pie to take to someone in the village or singing songs until dark. Dark happened in August. My roots desperately wanted to be planted in this northern country that seemed so austere in its distances, smelled like sour fish and smoke in its warm houses. I would spend winters reading and studying the voices of elders and historic travelers through the Kobuk country. Like all wannabes, I would come part of the way toward the authentic life of the place, stitching the air to the ground, trying to see beyond the apparent. I would constantly measure the depth of what might be below the surface, adding constantly to the ways that I knew I was a stranger.
That was the early part of the book, and I made a little note to myself, that wanting of roots. And as you move through the book, you develop a lot of those roots, and the way your life has been to stretch them both wide and deep, and you've done that through stories.
And another way you've done it, I was going to say, another way you've done it is through what you bring to the potlucks or the potlatches. And we could always count on you to bring a great pie, some music, and laughter. And so you're a good person to have in the community. And I was going to say one other thing about the firefighting. I remember when Kari first began to assert her own personality, she wanted ruffles. And you were bewildered about how you could get a child who wanted ruffles. You remember that? She was a little girl who wanted ruffles.
Yeah.
But that's another way of learning. Here's this person in your household who wants something that you don't know anything about.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everyone, every person, even the people in your own family are mysteries, aren't they? And when we write about them, I think poor Kari, she's listening now, and she's not a ruffles person anymore. But I certainly appropriated herself in many times, and she got used as a foil in many of these essays, trying to learn something about her and what a family was made of, which everybody makes up on their own. It's brand new every time we do it. Yeah. I feel like I didn't really realize this until I was thinking the discussions that went around before today, that not wanting to be a stranger when we came to Alaska was kind of answered in Don't Let Me Come Home a Stranger at the end of the book. I didn't know that. I just found that out because our closeness with Margaret, our friend who was losing her memory, and this is these events comprise the last story in the book, how neighbors conspired to allow a person who had no short-term memory but had been telling us these stories all of our time in McGrath for decades, and continued to tell us the story even when we would come in the door and she didn't know who we were, and she could still ease your hurt, and she could still make you feel like you were her family just by bringing you into her house and making tea for you. So that's what that was about.
Well, she's she tells you stories. And to go back to where you started at the very beginning, recovering the guy's name that seems to be lost. One of the things I wonder about, Mary, is you seem to feel like there's a strong obligation to preserve, to just remember. And how do you think that flows through this whole book?
Yeah. Well, I was telling Lisa on email last night, I don't have a good memory. I know this is a memoir and it's full of memories, but my memory is more like a cement mixer that something floats to the top and then it pops out and there it is in your sidewalk. So I go after those. I love that people can tell me stories. In my family, it's very important. I think I say my mom used to drag all of us from neighbor to neighbor that she was trying to help or take care of, and then those mostly older people would tell us stories. And I don't have a systematic way of remembering them, but I always have the sense that this knowledge that could do each other some good, that could give us bridges and connections, is flowing out of the world in every death and every loss of memory, and that just each of those things is important, and we trust that they're important, and we try to give that to each other.
But do you think that almost a Japanese assembly line kind of way, that you have a just-in-time memory, that just when you need to remember something because it explains the moment you're in, both in your life and in your essays, it just sort of, it's there.
Yeah. Yeah, and it works better as a writer than a talker, I have to say.
Yeah, it does.
Because when someone says something to you and you pop in your disassociative thing that gives you such a strong idea that it's connected, and they say, huh? Then you go to your journal and you figure out why that's connected, maybe.
But one of the important roles,
Yeah, go ahead.
but one of the important roles of this deep memory work that you do is to establish really where the narrator is coming from. And so I think that's one of the really crucial and perhaps more subtle ways that your text is continually acknowledging the issues that Lisa brought up. The section that you read does this acknowledgement quite gracefully and explicitly. But I think that also by bringing up really memories of where you come from, for example, you bring up the memory of the Snake River, which is a very different social space than the Alaskan rivers.
Yeah.
And part of what that does in the text is it really locates the narrator's places of origins, and therefore it gives her very solid ground to stand on without, whatsoever casting you as an interloper on someone else's ground. Your narrator is very conscious of what she's bringing and where her gaps are. And I think that's a really intriguing thing to track throughout the book.
Yeah. I don't know if you know the folk singer John Gorka. He has a beautiful song called "I Was Born to Ignorance and Privilege," and I'm pretty conscious. I try to stay conscious of both those things. When I looked at the Snake River and I was a child, it was just something to skip over on a bridge. I wasn't even aware of where it went if it wasn't under a bridge. And we lived less than a quarter of a mile. But it was dirty, so we didn't swim in it. I would catch catfish with my brother, and my mother would say, I don't want to eat those.
Mm.
Sometimes she would cook them because I wanted her to. But it was in the way, and no one had a boat tied up there on the Snake River. I think maybe things are a little different now. I think the river is cleaner. I think it's one of those things that's people have been conscious of in the world and made it better. I'm not sure about that. But when I got to Alaska, then the river is the road. The boats are on the river. You're watching the river as it comes up on a hot day because of the glacier, or it comes up on a rainy day because of the rain. It goes down. If neither of those things are going on, the boats get stranded. People help each other. They know who that boat belongs to, right, Lisa? You know who every boat belongs to at Nikolai or McGrath, and you go, oh man, Francis is going to be so disappointed because his boat's full of water. So the river came up and the thing was tied up too tight. So I'm going on, but it blew my mind how important rivers were, and that's where part of where Seeing the River came out of. And rivers are still important in Western Alaska and rural Alaska, and here the people who live along the Copper River are very aware as well. When the ice goes out, when it freezes up.
It wouldn't be too much of a stretch to borrow a braided river as a kind of metaphor for the structure of your book, and maybe some of what we mean by memoir and essays as opposed to just memoir or collection of essays. I was wondering if you wanted to talk at all about the short pieces, the sort of mini essays that you kind of pace the book with that come between the longer ones, the ones that are about food and sort of are kind of somewhat like recipes.
Yeah, at some point in putting these long essays together, I thought, some of the most basic things of our life are left out, and namely food. I mean, I don't know what's more important in this house. Maybe dogs. But I had some of those short. What was that? I wasn't watching. I had some of those short pieces at hand, and also the longer pieces have some humor, but they're not really vehicles for humor, and laughing is another thing that I wanted to make sure was in there. So a couple of the pieces do that, and some of the pieces are nods to my family and their. I'm so close with my brothers, and food and our mom and our aunts were so important to us that needed to be braided in, and so it was a way. After I started sort of sticking these between the essays, I thought, oh, I see connections where these short pieces answer some questions in the longer essays. So then I rearranged everything and let that was where structure came in. It was an afterthought, but I think it became important to the book. So does that answer your question, Jeremy?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's interesting. I'm curious if others, have any thoughts about that, or see some of the ways the book is the way the book functions is partly a result of that structural choice you've done. It's also interesting too, thinking about, so much of the book being about stories, often, other people's stories that you're a listener to of, and the rule of developing your sense of place, kind of as an act of listening, and then those short kind of food essays are more deep. It's more of a sense of, the people that we come from or have chosen to be with, and there's sort of an interesting relationship there. But yeah, any other thoughts about the structure of the book, or those recipes, or any of the other ideas she's brought up?
Yeah, I think it's true that they become an opportunity to make certain people that have been really important to us more visible, especially the family. Family is the source of discrepancy and irony. They say I love you, and then they slap you down, or they say I'm this kind of person, and then they go in the other room and they prove that they're not that kind of person at all. But you live with them, and you learn a kind of patience, and they teach you to gossip and how you should witness other people in the world. So the short essays became places where I could take a short shot at that. The lingonberry is about low bush cranberries and how they were harmed after Chernobyl. And as you know, Alaska is a place that accumulates environmental harm, as does the entire top of the world and the other pole as well, because pollutants go there through the air. It's very close here. It's the top of a disc, as that's in the essay. And so people picking berries being connected to people in Russia after that disaster, Alaska natives and other people, rural people, sent berries to Siberia because those people are our neighbors in a way that is not as intense when you're at a lower latitude and the world is fatter. So that was an important thing for that short essay to do. And then, of course, that's our food. That berry is so extremely important to a lot of people here, all rural people, especially indigenous folks.
Well, like the low bush cranberries, those little essays keep well. They'll keep all through the winter. No, it's just like to say they're delicious. I mean, they're lyrical, they're sensual, they are, you're able to put in ideas, but you're also able to give me enough of a recipe so I could actually cook with you. It's pretty darn marvelous.
Yeah, let's do it.
All right.
Okay. Well, I don't know. It looks like we might be getting close to time. I just want to express my gratitude to you folks for helping me launch the book. A lot of you helped me with the essays themselves from long ago, especially Frank. And the gracious Homer Bookstore, that's just a home away from home. And Peggy, your gentle nudging.
It's so exciting to see this in the world, clothed in the artwork of Sarah Tabbert.
Yes, thank you.
It's just such a beautiful book, inside and out. Thank you, Mary.
I want to do a little commercial about taking your time when you read these essays. And they're designed for contemplation and pausing a lot as you read, because Mary packs in all these different elements that you have to think through before you go on to the next paragraph. So this is a good time, and we're still more or less on our own to read slowly and truly absorb and enjoy these essays.
Lyric, that's a commercial for Lyric.
we just do essays. We don't need cons. But yeah.
Yeah, I have to agree. This was not a skimmable book. There was no way that I could skim it. I had to in fact, there was a 2-month period. I started reading it before COVID, and there was a 2-month period. I just had to put it down. I couldn't pick it up because I couldn't land and focus on anything long enough to read anything. And I knew that when I sat down to read your book, it wasn't something I could just skim through in a night. I needed to take it bit by bit. But it's like these little pieces of brown sugar in there that you stumble across, and you don't want to miss any of it.
That's virtual reality. I mean, you have an idea of who that audience is, but you never really know until you start to hear back from people what their experience was. So I'm really grateful for that too. Thanks, Lisa. Well, Jeremy, are we?
Well, thanks so much. Does anyone have any final questions or comments they'd like to ask Mary or share? Lisa?
Would you be willing to read that that paragraph at the top of page 228? I found that, coming at the end of the book, it was so powerful. It sort of brought together so many of those themes about identity and memory.
Thanks for asking. So this is about Margaret and McGrath and the friendship that kept her alive. Friendship is to some extent being a mirror for your friend. Your regard for her and your memories of experiences and conversations constantly reinforce her picture of her past self, her continuity, her creation myths. If memory is like a wool sock wearing out where you walk on it, then when the heels and the toes go, a friend can weave some yarn back and forth over the hole. Margaret couldn't remember if she'd had coffee in the morning, but if I came over and I reminded her that she was always a person who liked coffee in the morning, she'd answer back with a policy statement on coffee in the morning and on tea in the afternoon, and it led her to the stove and the water and the tea and the honey of the present moment.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. To everyone watching, I can't recommend this book highly enough. It's really fantastic and important book of interest to people all throughout the circumpolar north and beyond and below. So read it twice. Thanks to Boreal Books and Red Hen Press and the Homer Bookstore, and all of you on the panel today and everyone who's called in or is watching. Mary, congratulations! You've created something wonderful that we're glad is here with us. So with that, happy reading.
Thank you, Mary.
Deep gratitude. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, you were great.